December 1943. La Roche-Guyon, France. A 12th century chateau on the Seine, 60 miles from the coast. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has just finished a 2-week inspection of the Atlantic Wall, and he sits down to write his assessment for Adolf Hitler. Rommel has spent his career reading terrain and reading the enemy, and what he writes is that the main invasion will probably fall on the 15th Army's sector, the Pas-de-Calais, because the enemy's first concern will be to grab a port capable of handling large ships as fast as possible. Rundstedt agrees with him. So does the Kriegsmarine, and so, for what it's worth, does Hitler, who by this point in the war doesn't agree with Rommel about much. They have a reason to believe it. 2 years earlier, in August 1942, the Allies threw 6,000 men at the French port of Dieppe in a single morning and got cut to pieces on the beach. The lesson every German officer took from that day was simple. An invasion has to seize a port, and Dieppe had just proven a direct assault on one fails. So the Germans built their wall accordingly, pouring the thickest concrete around Calais and Boulogne, and every harbor between the Somme and the Scheldt, while Normandy got comparatively less. They weren't wrong that the Allies needed a port. They were wrong about the timing. More than a year before Rommel wrote that memo, the Allies had already decided they wouldn't rely on capturing one during the initial assault. They'd bring their own harbor instead, and open the invasion somewhere the Germans considered secondary. And the men carrying the first wave ashore weren't going to step onto a dock. They were going to ride a flat-bottomed plywood boat with a steel ramp bolted to the bow, designed by a boat builder from New Orleans who'd never worn a uniform, for trappers and oil drillers who needed to get in and out of a Louisiana swamp. This is the story of that boat, and of a line spoken years later by the man who commanded the invasion. Start in the bayous of southern Louisiana in the 1920s, because that's actually where the boat that landed at Normandy was born. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in Columbus, Nebraska in 1886, got expelled from a Catholic high school in Omaha for fighting, and drifted south into the lumber trade. By the early 1920s, he was running a small lumber company out of New Orleans with a practical problem. The best timber sat in shallow, snag-choked bayous that no boat on the market could reach without fouling its propeller or running aground. Higgins had no training as a naval architect. He took a correspondence course in one and built his own answer, a shallow draft, flat-bottomed hull with the propeller tucked into a recessed tunnel where logs and sandbars couldn't reach it. He called it the Eureka Boat. Bootleggers liked it during Prohibition because it could outrun a Coast Guard cutter into 3 feet of water. Oil drillers liked it because it could get a rig crew into a marsh no conventional launch could touch. By the late 1930s, Higgins was running a small, struggling shipyard on City Park Avenue, and the boat that would help decide the shape of the war already existed. It just didn't have a war yet. The Navy's own Bureau of Ships had spent years trying to design a landing craft the Marine Corps could actually use, without much luck. Higgins put it more bluntly than any officer would have dared. The Navy, he said, didn't know one damn thing about small boats. In the late 1930s, Marine officers, including Major General Holland Howell and Mad Smith, saw the Eureka Boat and thought it might be what the Marines had been asking for, except for one problem. It had no ramp. Troops had to climb over the gunwales to get out, exposed and slow, exactly the vulnerability an assault force couldn't afford in the first seconds on a defended beach. The fix came from an odd direction. Since the summer of 1937, the Japanese had been using landing boats with ramp bows during their war in China, and American observers in Shanghai had taken note. When Higgins saw a photograph of one, he didn't wait for a study or a committee. He phoned his chief engineer and had a mock-up ready to inspect the moment he got home. Within a month, trials of a ramp-bowed Eureka on Lake Pontchartrain proved it worked. Later, when the Navy said they'd need a design for a tank-carrying version and asked how long a proposal would take, Higgins skipped the proposal. He told them he'd have an actual boat ready to look at. When they said that couldn't be done in the time he named, he built it in 61 hours. That one became the LCM, the tank lighter. The ramp-bowed Eureka became the LCVP, landing craft, Vehicle, personnel, 36 feet of plywood hull with a steel ramp on the bow, carrying roughly 36 men, or a jeep, or about 4 tons of cargo, able to run itself onto open sand, drop the ramp, unload, back off, and go get more. Nobody called it the LCVP. They called it the Higgins Boat. Higgins filed the patent on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. German coastal planning assumed an amphibious force would need a working deep-water port within days of landing, because that had been true of every serious landing in history. Ports have cranes, deep channels, warehouses, rail lines. An army can't live on a beach forever. The Allies knew this too, and they wanted ports badly, planning to grab Cherbourg fast and Brest not long after. But Dieppe had already shown that a fortified port would get shelled and bombed into wreckage before anyone could use it, captured or not. So instead of opening the invasion with a direct hit on a harbor, the British built something the Germans had no answer for, an artificial harbor called Mulberry, assembled in sections in England, and towed across the channel to a beach that had no port at all. Behind it, doing the actual work of getting men onto dry land, were thousands of Higgins boats, launched from ships, anchored miles offshore, running troops straight onto sand the Germans had judged too unlikely to fortify the way they'd fortified Calais. The historian Terence Robertson's read on the German reaction to Dieppe is that their defenses afterward got reorganized around the likely invasion ports, leaving the open beaches where Overlord actually landed comparatively weaker. The Germans had the mattering part right. They got the timing wrong. By June 6, 1944, Higgins Industries was nothing like the struggling shipyard it had been. It had grown into one of the biggest employers in the country, producing more than even the Navy's own bureaucracy had expected. The company built over 20,000 boats of all types during the war, roughly 12,500 of them LCVPs, with a workforce that by 1943 ran into the tens of thousands, hired without regard to race, sex, age, or disability, itself a radical practice in the wartime South. Higgins marked his 10,000th boat in July 1944, weeks after Normandy, with plenty more to come. By some wartime estimates, roughly 90% of the Navy's small landing craft were Higgins designs, though the exact number depends on how you count it. Adolf Hitler, watching American shipbuilding output with something close to alarm, reportedly nicknamed Higgins the new Noah, though historians can't fully confirm he actually said it. At 6:28 that morning, the first Higgins boats hit Utah Beach. Coast Guard photographer Robert F. Sargent was aboard one of them, heading for Omaha, and the picture he took as the ramp dropped and the men of the 16th Infantry Regiment waded into the surf became one of the defining images of the war. Later titled, "Into the Jaws of Death," every soldier who set foot on a Normandy beach that day, and every Marine who came ashore at Tarawa, Peleliu, or Iwo Jima after it, arrived the same way, over a plywood ramp built by a company that 6 years earlier had been making boats for men who hunted alligators for a living. The German plan leaned on the assumption that the invasion had to open at a port, because in every earlier war of this size, it had. Rommel wasn't careless, and he wasn't a fool. He read the ground right. He read Dieppe right. What he couldn't have accounted for was a landing at a scale nobody had tried before, one that could supply itself without a port for as long as it took to take one properly. The 15th Army, or most of it, sat near Calais through much of that summer, still waiting for the blow Rommel's memo had promised would land there. While the real invasion tore through Normandy on beaches the German plan had always treated as secondary. Dwight Eisenhower, who as Supreme Allied Commander had signed off on both the Mulberry Harbours and the Higgins production run, was asked, years later, by historian Stephen Ambrose, what actually made the invasion possible. No recording or transcript survives. What we have is Ambrose's account of the conversation. In it, Eisenhower didn't credit a general or a weapon. He credited the boat. Andrew Higgins, he said, is the man who won the war for us, adding that without the LCVPs, the Allies could never have landed over an open beach, and the whole strategy of the war would have looked different. A boat builder from Nebraska, who didn't design anything for the military until his 40s, had already solved, years ahead of time, and for a completely different reason, a problem German planners assumed still had no fast answer. The Wehrmacht built its strongest wall to stop an army that would need a port on day one. The army that landed in June 1944 didn't need one that fast. It brought enough of its own beach with it, one plywood boat at a time. Higgins died in New Orleans on August 1952, 6 years before an interstate was named for him, running past the old plant on City Park Avenue. Most of the men who rowed his boats onto the sand at Utah and Omaha and Tarawa never met him and never knew his name. They knew the boat. If your father or grandfather came ashore in one, in any theater, in any year of the war, his memory of that ramp dropping belongs in the comments. Subscribe if you want the next one.